construction of CFAS Center. Many of the Hall B people worked in those trailers like elbow to elbow in this large room. It was very intimate at first.
Life in the trailers was more like rustic than intimate. Some offices were about 3 steps away from the muddy paths in the pine forest. Others seemed so remote you needed a map to find them. There were a lot more deer and a lot more toads underfoot. For outside users, coming to the lab felt a bit like going camping.
Yeah, food in the trailer city was just one vending machine. Do you remember that? I mean, we didn't eat at the lab very often. That's why we went out all the time.
In that same era, I recall a plenary discussion led by Larry Dennis where we picked the name for the collaboration. CLAS was the winner, but it could have been LAS, L-A-S, or CLAS, C-L-A-S-S. After that vote for CLAS, we really felt like a collaboration.
Do you remember the early hall?
Sure. The photon tagger was installed first in Hall B. The hall was totally empty otherwise. I recall a picture of the Catholic University team with Hall Cornell standing proudly next to the dipole magnet while it was still prone on the experimental floor.
That's right. Building CLAS was really complicated. It was like Reinhardt pointed out, it was like building a ship in a bottle. And now we have to take the ship out of the bottle, and I guess, do we have to put it back in?
Yeah, for example, I vividly remember that the steel pieces of the forward carriage were assembled in a couple of days by one guy with a sledgehammer, a big wrench, and a crane. We were doing Region 1 tests on the space frame at the time so we could watch him. Man, was that hammering noisy. Well, it's time for us to commemorate all of that work that went into designing, building, commissioning, and operating our beautiful CLAS detector.
Yes, indeed. From the thousands of PMTs, this is where the music's supposed to come in, from the thousands of PMTs tested and adjusted, to the many square miles of lead sheet pounded flat, to the huge effort of ray tracing the Cherenkov counter, it's exhausting to even think about, not to mention the beamline and data acquisition projects.
But aren't you forgetting the drift chambers? They were a bit of work also.
But many hands make light work, as they say. Besides, what a harmonious group. Can you imagine people like Steve Deitman, or Larry Weinstein, or Rich Magahiz, or Brian Rowie getting in an argument? But it was always very civil and polite. By the way, I want to acknowledge the fine effort put in by CMU and Pitt on building Region 1.
Thank you.
Yeah, in fact, I don't know how many of you remember this, but Reinhardt and Rich Magahiz spent weeks in the Eel building, or maybe it was months, I think it was weeks, doing this, what they call tension transfer. So where was that tension transferred?
To me, I guess. But you and Steve Christo did so much developing all the drift chambers. And for years, visitors arriving at the local airport saw a big picture in the concourse illustrating high-tech development in Virginia. There was a picture of you and Steve gazing in deep concentration at a maze of wires.
There was one that was broken in there, you didn't know that. But it was great to have a big and dependable team of people to make it all happen.
We certainly had a dependable, hard-working leader in Bernard. He wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty.
That's right. I still remember, I don't know how many of you know this, but he measured the magnetic field in the bore of the torus by hand. he put this Hall probe like on a big yardstick, I think, or maybe a broomstick. I'm not sure. But then no, but it was kind of precise. But then he had he had this hand-drawn angle measuring device, so he could turn it at different orientations, and then he knew how far it would go in. It was a yardstick, I think, and he wrote down in a logbook, you know, the magnetic field versus phi and z, and it was so amazing. We could actually, from those measurements, we could tell where how the coils were displaced by about 0.5 millimeter.
Yeah, and then on the days of the first beam in Hall B, there was really standing room only in the counting house. And such a huge blast of current came into the hall initially that the scintillator PMTs became activated. And we had to let them cool for hours to reduce the count rates back to a reasonable level.
That's right, and on the Hall B website you can see movies of all that, by the way. And what about all those people who put in huge efforts during the early days of commissioning?
Yes, and do you remember how Volker sat looking at thousands of CED pictures? I mean, literally thousands. And by doing that, he found some things like swap drift chamber cables.
You're right, it was a monumental effort. And what about Dan Corman? He's not here, he's probably working, but I think he looked at all 34,000 drift chamber wires on an oscilloscope.
Well, Dan was always like that. What about his buddy Brian Rowie and the ODU gang? They spent week after week adjusting tensions on the torus coils. Who would have imagined that the whole thing would work and keep working for 14 years? Those early days were fun but also stressful.
But we've turned it off. Before we celebrate though, but you know, in those early days, we would see something odd in the counting house, and we wouldn't have any idea which system might be malfunctioning.
But one thing we knew, to quote Dave Dowdy, it's never the trigger.
But at least we always had a safe haul.
Safe haul, yes, but I remember something about a Cherenkov counter. Oh, never mind.
Well, anyway, it wasn't safe by accident. Do you remember how much time and effort Steve Christo and Will Brooks put into that sniffer system?
Anyway, we finally got it all going and started taking data.
Yeah. Do you remember? Yes, all those new systems to learn.
Well, the beamline always worked well. Volker, Stepan, Kovanis, Arn, Mark, etc. made sure we always got good beam.
That's true. But do you remember the alarm for the drift chamber low voltage system?
Right. It was the voice. Amrit's recorded voice came out of nowhere to startle you, to tell you to go check the low voltage system for the drift chambers. Everyone complained about it. So he found a nice new voice for the system, and he was years ahead of Siri.
Where am I? Well, at least we had good pager support.
Yes, I estimated that Sergei Boryanov got at least 3,000 pages over the years. Besides the DAQ, the EC high voltage crate number 5 was the second highest source of pages, with about 1,157 pages for that crate alone.
We always had good online display and monitoring.
Indeed. Dave Heddle's CED and Jerry Guilfoyle's online Rexus and Mark's monitor button, Sergey and company's many DAC monitors and others, they all worked.
Amazingly enough.
And now we have to mention software.
You're right. I remember that Bogdan wrote the whole tracking code program, SDA, with just one undergraduate helping him.
Yes, I don't think Bogdan's here, but it was quite a feat. But then, do you remember what happened?
Sure. Curtis Meyer stole it in the night and wrapped it in Arndt's Rexus program. And then Franz and Jim improved it. And then Dennis and company wrote A1C, etc., etc.
Well, on to happier topics. Let's talk about collaboration meetings. They were fun.
Yes, and we always had an excellent parliamentarian. I love to hear the many fine points raised by Jim O'Brien. At least the first time he would bring something up.
Some of the meetings were boisterous. Gail remembers taking over as chair of the membership committee when she was quite new in the collaboration. And she didn't realize what she was getting into, I guess, because she found it to be a really unruly bunch. She remembers threatening to hit Paul Stoller with a big pointer stick in A110 if he did not keep quiet.
Well, one of Gail's remembrances was about you. She remembers a collaboration meeting in which you foolishly suggested that we put a couple of people permanently in charge of doing various calibrations so that it would take less time and be more efficient to analyze the data. You were shouted down by those who felt that students should entirely analyze all of their own data.
What a silly idea I had. But you know, Steve Dykeman pointed out that's what happens when a bunch of nuclear physicists try to work in a high-energy style collaboration.
Well, all in all, it has worked out very well so far, with over 100 PhDs earned and well over 100 great publications. Who knew 23 years ago that this is where we would wind up?
And that reminds me that it's time to wind down our act, and I hope that all of you have been thinking of something you want to say, and come on up and say it.
You are right. Maybe some of the other people here would like to take the microphone and speak. So.